Good evening. It's just past 6 o'clock, and I'd like to wish you a very warm welcome to this launch of a Mediators Musings by John Sturrock. The book went on sale this week on Amazon. It's on paperback and Kindle, and the proceeds are going to cancer research. The link is in your invite. A few weeks ago, for those of you of a certain age, Zoom conjured up images of a rocket-shaped ice lolly, but this new version now is becoming increasingly part of our lives. So I would recommend that you put your view onto speaker view. And as you can see, all of you are muted apart from the speakers, and that improves the sound quality. There's no fire alarm planned, and I assume you know where the nearest bathrooms are. I'm going to start with a couple of brief introductions, and then I'm going to have a conversation with John for a wee while. And then after that, there will be the opportunity for some questions, but we're not going to do them sort of verbally. I'm going to ask if you would write them in the chat column, and I'll try and summarize these and pass these on to John. And we aim to finish at 7 o'clock. So let me, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Charlie Woods. I'm an associate of CORE. I trained with John in 2007 on the mediation skills training. And in many respects, it changed my life, certainly in terms of how I understand other people and engage with them. Working with John has thrown up all sorts of opportunities for me, and for which I'm very grateful, plus the opportunity to converse about the state of the world, music, football, and other weighty matters. Although the less said about football, the better. And for some of us, the lockdown is actually something of a relief. But enough of me. Let me get on to the main course, so to speak. John needs no introduction from me, from most of you, but for those of you who may not know him so well, following a successful early career at the bar, where he became a QC, around 20 years or so ago, he took something of a step into the unknown to start CORE, and from there he's been at the forefront of the development of mediation in Scotland and beyond, both as a practicing mediator and as a trainer, coach, entrepreneur and thinker. He's taken mediation skills beyond dispute resolution into many, many spheres of leadership, in business, public policy and sport, to name but a few. So there's no question that John's made a major contribution in so many areas over the years, and it was great to see him bringing this together, bringing some of his ideas together into this book. So John, before we get into talking about the book directly, there was some music playing at the beginning there. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a bit tinny, wasn't it, Charlie? Before I do that, can I just say a very warm welcome to everybody, and thank you so much for coming along. It's quite humbling, actually, that we actually reached 100 registrants this afternoon. I've had to take out an expanded or enhanced Zoom package in order to cope with it all. And we've actually got people here, if I may just say, from all around the world: Macedonia, Greece, the Netherlands, Germany, Ireland, Australia, Italy, Spain, Serbia, Poland, India, United States, Canada, Russia. So you're all very welcome, and thank you so much for coming out to be here this evening in this extraordinarily different environment. Yeah, the piece of music that didn't quite come across as profoundly, perhaps, as we hoped it would, was entitled Time and a Word. It's one of the earliest songs of the progressive rock band Yes. Now, those of you who know me will know that I am a great aficionado of progressive rock. The Yes song, Time and a Word, was actually released almost exactly 50 years ago, on the 24th of July, 1970, in the album of that name. And I selected it really because it seemed to me that the words time and a word resonated very much, Charlie, with what we're doing this evening. Time, I think the vocals are that the time, or the lyrics, the time is now and it's right for me. And those of you who know me will know that I've been trying to produce a book for the last several years. I've got 2 or 3 well written, one actually substantially written, but the perfectionist in me has prevented me from completing them. So this was a kind of next best, in the sense that all of these pieces of writing were complete, and I was able to draw them together into this book. So the time seemed to be right. And a word, time and a word. For me, words have been I suppose, right at the heart of everything I've been for the last 20, 30 years, 40 years nearly, actually, because at the bar, we used to have this little phrase, every word carefully chosen for its task. And those who know me, and Paula's here, and Miriam, who used to work with me, are here, they know very well I can see a missing semicolon from 400 miles away. And so that idea of the word, and I suppose the book here is a collection of words of topics that seem important to me. And it was really interesting that the very last change we made to the book was to add a little note at the end of the second last piece, recognizing that the use of the word mankind in a quotation from Bertrand Russell had a certain gender bias, and it was important to include the word humankind in the refrain of the article. But maybe the word that struck me most in the song is again in the lyric, because what John Anderson sings is the time is right and the word is love. And I wanted just to major in that just for a second or two, particularly at this time. One of the pieces in the book is about the Scottish National Performance Framework, within which there are these words. And let me just look to my left, because I've got some notes on my screen here, that we're all entitled to grow up, loved, safe and respected. And it's remarkable that a government document in Scotland should have the word love in it. And just to conclude this bit, the most recent progressive rock concert I went to was by the fabulous band Pendragon, whose most recent album is called Love Over Fear. And if ever there were words that are apt for the time, let love prevail over fear seems to be the most appropriate. So there we are, Charlie. There's a long answer to your question about the song that we had, and maybe a little bit about the book as well.
Yeah. Well, before we move on to your book, am I right in thinking that this isn't the first Sturrock book launch this week?
That's right, actually, yes. So my daughter Jennifer launched her book on Monday. It's a book of poetry and designs. And you mentioned the proceeds of this book going towards cancer research. Jennifer was diagnosed with thyroid cancer just at the end of last year, treated very quickly. The surgery was very successful. We wanted to really honour the treatment that she had by putting the proceeds of this project to cancer research. So yes, she launched her book on Monday. And in fact, if I look behind me, Jennifer this afternoon has prepared for me a flip chart sheet, which is on the wall up here. Those of you who know me from mediations will know that in the joint meeting we have, or the plenary session we have, before we go into the meat of the mediation, we usually have over breakfast, and I will usually get the flip chart out and I'll draw a piece of cheese with mice on the flip chart looking at the different perspectives. So there's the piece of cheese, which is one set of facts, if you like, or one fact, and yet looking at it from different perspectives as the mice are, we see very different truths. All of these, of course, are valid from their point of view. So just thought I'd mention that, Charlie. And actually behind me, I've got the map of all the cognitive biases that the brain tends to entrap us with. And that allows me to mention another couple of the pieces in the book, particularly reflecting on Tim Hicks's book, Embodied Conflict. I think Tim is actually here from Oregon this evening. Welcome, Tim, or good morning to you. And that was a very significant piece of work. And just that whole area of neuroscience is very important to me. So these in the back of the wall are for when I do my Zoom mediation, so I can refer those who are involved in the mediation to these important concepts.
And that piece of cheese very much illustrates that, what I think was Margaret Hefferman's point about it's in the intersection of perspectives that real insight is generated. So that's interesting. So anyway, enough of the background and the associated music and the like. Why a book?
Well, actually, there's a question really here about what part the ego plays in all of this, isn't it? I mean, I love writing, and I really enjoy sitting down and putting these pieces together. And whether or not with justification, I just felt it was appropriate to draw all these pieces together, because what I write about is really important to me. And these are ideas I desperately and passionately wish were more part of the currency of our thinking in so many fields and disciplines in life. So I really want to just try to gather them together and maybe reach a slightly wider audience than sometimes I do in the newspapers or blog sites in which they originally appeared.
Mm-hmm. So you say you love writing there. I mean, what have you learned about the writing process over the years as you've been pulling these pieces together?
Well, it's interesting because when I started out, it was a very laborious process for me, and I used to take hours, if not days, to pull together a 600 or 700 word article, or even less. If you're writing for the Times, and I think Magnus Llewellyn, the editor of the Times, may be with us this evening. If you're writing for the Times, you've got 425 or 450 words. So I found that really difficult because, in a sense, I had so much to say, or at least I had so many words to use to say it. So I think what I've learned is the discipline of distilling ideas and finding the essence of them. And the more I've done it, the easier it seems to have become. So I tend to, I read a book or I see something, or something happens to be in a mediation, or there's a moment in time, and something happens and resonates, and it gives me the kind of, I suppose, a springboard to write something which then seems to flow with a number of other events that maybe have occurred at about the same time.
Mm-hmm. So the book itself, I mean, how's it structured? Can you give people any tips as the best way to read it to get the most out of it?
Well, that's an interesting question. Probably a book to dip into. I think I say that in the introduction. There are 5 sections. It started off with 4, but we've just added a 5th one because of the coronavirus epidemic. And one of the complications of being a perfectionist, even with a book like this, which ought to have been, in a sense, complete when we started it, was that I still was kind of working away at it into March. And I have had 2 or 3 pieces written during the currency of this extraordinary situation that faces us. So we added a section called A Changing World, but the existing sections were general reflections. Then there are a few articles about negotiation, then quite a few articles about mediation and the practice of mediation, and then a further quite substantial section on politics. And what I've realized going through it all today again, Charlie, is that really a lot of them overlap. For example, the negotiation pieces talk substantially about Brexit, which has clearly been very much in my mind as a negotiating example in recent years. And I see I've used that Bertrand Russell quotation at least 3 times, if not more. And I think there may even be one piece, which if I look at it now, I think that's probably extraneous because it tends to overlap quite a lot with what's gone before. But that's it. There's a kind of broad set of themes, but they are interdependent, as I often say in the book, and overlapping as well.
Okay. Which of the pieces gives you the most satisfaction? What are the highlights for you?
Interesting. Well, the first couple, actually, and maybe these were selected for a good reason, are 2 that reflect situations that made a very big impact to me. So the first one, I think, is entitled A Moment in Time, and it's about a visit to Japan and the impact on me, of visiting Hiroshima and being in Hiroshima, actually standing at the very point above which the atomic bomb went off in 1945, and seeing the shell of the one remaining building, which is iconic now, and then going into the extraordinarily graphic and poignant museum of artifacts. And I suppose that got me thinking about, just an instant in time, 70,000 people or so were eviscerated. And on that same trip, we took part in the Japanese tea ceremony. Ichikochi is the word that describes what they see in the tea ceremony, and that is the recognition of the moment in time, that every meeting happens only once. Never again will you have that moment when you meet and enjoy, sip a cup of tea. And so I suppose for me, there are 2 contrasts there in our human existence about what can happen in a very, very short period of time. And it was interesting actually just looking back at that and writing about, we don't know what's going to come, what's around the corner in just a moment in time. And here we are now in this coronavirus emergency. So that was one example. The other one, the second one, involves cups of tea as well. And that was a remarkable occasion where we had actually around our table here at home, and then in a conference of the Scottish mediation people a couple of years ago, Joe Berry and Patrick Magee. Now, Joe Berry's father was Sir Anthony Berry. He was killed in the Brighton bombing, and Patrick Magee is the man who planted the bomb. And for the last nearly 20 years, Joe Berry and Patrick Magee have been meeting together and publicly discussing what happened. Joe's quest was to find out why Patrick Leahy had done this, and you know, it is most extraordinary, heartbreaking, but also life-giving story. So that was an article. And again, what I think Joe's point was, we need to have, for diplomacy purposes, a cups of tea policy. In other words, we do sit down and talk with people, even if they are perhaps seen as our enemies, and doing so over a cup of tea is, you know, emblematic of the way in which that might be done. Another one which again struck me reading through was entitled "What's the Point?" I think I was going through a kind of existential crisis. You know, what's the point of all of this? What's life all about? And I was reflecting on Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, where, let me just say, there's a quote actually, which I should have here on my iPad, which is one I often use at the beginning of our mediation training course. So Frankl, who spent a lot of time in a Nazi prisoner of war camp, a concentration camp, Auschwitz, I think, said, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And what he was saying is that whatever's going on the outside, there is something within us, if we choose to find us, which gives us an ability to cope with even the most difficult situations. But I think the conclusion for me of that piece was, maybe all we can do, and maybe the most we can do, and what we are called to do, is to be present with the person nearest to it at any one time. Remarkable thought, I suppose, again, during these remarkable times. But being as loving and as kind as we can be to the person, or the people nearest us, is a theme that seems to recur in the book. Kindness, I suppose, is a theme that recurs. But I was, as you know, asked by the Cabinet Secretary for Health to prepare a report on allegations of bullying in NHS Highland last year. And it seemed to me that profoundly what was needed and is needed in so many of our organisations or workplaces is a sense of compassion and kindness. So these are themes, Charlie. I mean, you asked me about some of the highlights. These are some of the highlights. As I was going back through the book yesterday and today, just reminding myself, there's one further one though, and that was, I think it's under reference to you, because you talk so often about being guerrilla gardeners. When we plant seeds, and we don't know what the seed may bear in terms of fruit, but we hope that somewhere there maybe there's some flourishing. And you also talk about having a plan and then playing it by ear. Otherwise you can have all these things planned out, but who knows what might happen. So my final reflection is the blog, which I'd forgotten about actually until I read it today. And that was the occasion where I ate a chicken curry one night in Aberdeen at the end of a mediation, and got on the sleeper to go to another mediation in London the following day. And by 6:30 in the morning, in fact 4:30 in the morning, the chicken curry was disagreeing with me. It obviously had been a bad chicken curry. And my plans for the following day and the running of the mediation had to change fairly substantially, given the state of severe ill health. But the mediation still went ahead. And so the point of that, I think, was, well, I can't remember what the point was. You have to read the book to find out.
Yes, there's a whole section that you mentioned there in the book on politics, which some might find interesting. What's behind that? Is it about the policies themselves, or is it more about how politics is done?
Well, it's more the latter than the former, I suppose. I've been very fortunate over the last several years to be involved in all sorts of interesting work in and around the field of policy and politics. Actually, for me, it goes right back to 1983. Many of you will not know this, and this is a reveal which may cause me mortal damage. But back in 1983, I was on a platform at a party political conference. I still have got the video of me arguing that more than half of those who are in prison should be released as part of an enlightened penal policy. The then Prime Minister was shaking her head, and the Home Secretary had his head in his hands. I should say that was a particular time in my life. I've moved on since then, I'm sure, in many ways, politically and otherwise. So I've always had an interest in politics, Charlie, and over the years, I've worked with nearly all the political organised, structured institutions in the UK, all the parliaments, in training for scrutiny purposes, so training committees and others in questioning techniques. But from around 2010 to 2011 onwards, I've worked quite extensively with the Scottish Government in really in strategy and negotiation, in how to prepare to negotiate more effectively, and in various policy areas. And what I think I think about when I see politics these days is the binary nature of the way in which it's conducted, the often uncivilized tone, the adversarial approach. I mean, for me, as a former advocate in the courts, the Westminster model of parliamentary democracy, as presented to us so often from Westminster, is so, it seems so primitive and so unsophisticated in a world which we know is so much more complicated, complex, uncertain, ambiguous, paradoxical. There are so many sides to a story. I mean, just look at the cheese behind me. There are so many sides to a story. So part of my quest has been to try to, I don't know, to try to help politicians and people who think about politics to think, to view politics in a different way, to see if we can find different ways of doing politics which recognize the complexity and the uncertainty and the need to be cooperative, the need to work with each other, the idea which you've taught me so much about, that the adversarial approach can so often lead to zero-sum results, whereas working collaboratively and cooperatively, we can often build on each other's ideas and produce better outcomes for the people we serve. So it may be awfully naive, and I've had a bit of a discussion with one of my mediator colleagues in England today, who has said it's really not our business as mediators to be getting involved in politics. We shouldn't be expressing any sort of view, even about the way politics is done. But I think we do need to do that. And there's a piece actually in the book in which, without taking any political stance, I think what we do as mediators is really important. You know, interest-based negotiation, finding out what the underlying interests are, exploring the options, having objective criteria to assess the various options, and so forth and so on. I mean, just imagine if these were adopted as a means by which political decisions were made. It may be that out of the coronavirus situation, that politicians necessarily will need to work together as we shape or mould a new future. And it's been remarkable, I think, hasn't it, how so many of the politicians, certainly at the start of this process, undertook to work with each other, expressed the view that they would make mistakes, were told by their counterparts that yes, they would make mistakes, but we were all in this together, we were all going to support you. How long that will hold, I don't know, but one would hope that out of this, maybe the realization that we are interdependent, truly interdependent the world over, and therefore we need to find ways by which our politics can represent that interdependence. So, as I say, naive it may be, but in one of the articles I say, well, the present system hasn't necessarily served us all that well. And, you know, if that's the benchmark, can we do something that's at least marginally better going forward in politics? And so that's what I hope to get out and about, and I hope people will think about it. And I have to say, Charlie, that there are a lot of politicians, a lot of people working in the government, in politics and policy making, who do understand all this stuff. In fact, that brings to mind the event that we had a couple of years ago when the International Academy of Mediators were here in Edinburgh, and we had the great William Ury of Getting to Yes fame speaking in the Scottish Parliament, and he was followed by the First Minister, who made, for my purposes, one of the best speeches I've ever heard him make, and she certainly showed that she understood the power of interest-based negotiation and multiple views and the need to work together. The question, I suppose, really is whether or not that can find real traction in the visceral world of political party politics.
Yes, but as you say, the current pandemic certainly reinforces how interdependent we all are now, and that certainly for me was a word that came up quite a lot in looking at the book. Moving on from the sort of the broader picture there to maybe more looking at the mediation side of things, I mean, how do you see the direction of travel as far as mediation has gone over the period that you've been writing these pieces?
Well, on my screen, I can see Charlie Irvine, and I think of Charlie and I going back over many years. I'd say fighting the good fight, that's not the right way, but extolling the virtues of mediation in our own very different ways. I think it's really interesting. I gave a talk to the Scottish Mediation annual conference about 18 months ago, and I happened to have found during an office move a lot of papers which I had accumulated over many years. I went back and looked at the papers in the late 90s and the early 2000s and found that a lot of the arguments that we're making now were the same arguments we were making 20 years ago. And there was quite a deep realization for my part that while a lot of interesting progress has been made, and let's not diminish that, in many ways in Scotland, we were still on the foothills. And I don't know whether that sparked it, but from that time, there was a sort of momentum built up. So I think there's the backdrop still of Scotland in many respects being, people in Scotland being reluctant to use mediation, although there are fabulous pockets of examples of mediation being used really well. However, I was privileged to co-chair a group looking last year at mediation. We produced a report called Bringing Mediation into the Mainstream. And the Scottish Government now is heartily behind that, and in fact was going fairly full steam ahead towards implementing many of the recommendations. Of course, all of that will be on hold now with the coronavirus pandemic. But I think there are straws in the wind, more than straws in the wind. There are signs, I think, that people are beginning to appreciate the value that mediation can bring. I have a quotation, in fact, which I noted down in a recent mediation. Let me see if I can find it, which kind of summarizes the whole thing for me, and I suppose expresses the frustration which I and so many people feel. So I had two principals quite late on in a mediation day, and one said to the other, "You and I could have had this conversation 18 months ago, and we've since spent £600,000 on lawyers. It's bollocks," excuse the French. So I suppose that what we see, those of us who work in the field, we see many, many examples of difficult situations being resolved fairly quickly, fairly satisfactorily, and people being able to get on with their lives. So I think that penny is dropping, but hasn't dropped perhaps as quickly as some of us hoped it might in this jurisdiction. And I think it's probably the same around the world. There are different emphases around the world, but it may well be that we're moving into another phase. It may very well be that the situation now with the civil courts being unable physically to conduct cases, obviously they're going to go online as much as they can, but there's going to be quite a severe impact, I suspect, on civil litigation in particular. It may just be that mediation will now find a more substantial place in the framework, and people will be happier to use mediation. Having said that, of course, the great beauty of mediation is face-to-face meetings. And while Zoom is being used for mediation now, I suppose it can never quite replicate the intimacy which mediation offers to people in the process. So it's a mixed bag, Charlie. I'm looking at my notes to see if there's anything else that I wanted to say about that. You might be going to ask me about resistance to mediation. Maybe I'll just pick up the point. I mean, I did write one blog about e-bikes, electric bikes, and I think what we do need to be aware of is that for some reason or other, and it'd be interesting to have views on this, there is a deep-seated resistance to using mediation amongst many of those who otherwise go to court or have disputes. And I think we still haven't quite understood just how deep that is and why that's there. But the article on riding an e-bike gave me a part of the explanation, because what I realized was that here was this newfangled idea. It was going to cost some money. Somebody tell me I could do something easier than the way I'd done it for the past 40 years. Whereas I much preferred something to ride my bike. Thank you very much indeed. I'd always done it that way. It suited me fine. And it was a little bit of a threat to be told that there was this new way of doing things. And it was only when I got on the e-bike and used it and found it absolutely marvelous that I realized what a benefit it could be. And yet I was still in control of my use of it. So there's something there perhaps of an analogy for us in the mediation path as well.
Okay, well, as a cyclist who still hasn't got on his e-bike, then I'll have to work. I'll have to work on that one. I mean, what gives you the most hope in terms of how the situation might be changing with regard to mediation?
Well, I think that report, Bringing Mediation into Mainstream, is a very interesting piece of work, and the fact that the government have picked it up and are running with it is good. We know that Margaret Mitchell, MSP, also produced a report through the Justice Committee in the Scottish Parliament, which said very similar things and was very clearly committed to the greater use of mediation. So I think in a Scottish context, that offers real hope. I write in the book actually about younger people. Every year I have the privilege of going off to Paris to the International Chamber of Commerce annual mediation competition. That's a bit of a, what's the word I'm looking for, an oxymoron almost, to have a mediation competition, but we'll leave that to the side. But hundreds of young people come from universities across the world, and despite their differences culturally, politically and otherwise, they share a common understanding of the value of negotiation and cooperative problem solving. And every year I come back thinking there is hope, because the younger generation get that very, very much. Now, how widespread that is remains to be seen, but it may fall to us. Most of us here are of the older generation, but by no means all of us. And I think it really falls to us, particularly at this time, to encourage the next generation coming through, who are going to have to pick up the pieces of the mess that this whole, not just this pandemic, but climate change and so forth are creating. So the hope must lie there, and I hope it does lie there, in addition to whatever we can do locally and nationally as a country.
You mentioned the pandemic a few times now, and just mentioned climate change there. I mean, yeah. How do you think these significant emergencies are going to influence matters in our business?
Well, the first thing that strikes me is here we are, we've got people watching from all around the world. And so far as I can tell from previous engagements like this with my colleagues from around the world, we are all experiencing the same thing. So this is an extraordinary common human experience. So I suspect never in human existence, in human species existence, has something like this occurred. So, you know, that gives us real pause for thought, doesn't it? And the question arises then, what do we do with that common experience? The real danger, and we see it played out every day, is that politically what we'll end up with is scapegoating, us and them, and the looking for fault and blame, and that there'll be a massive divergence at national levels as people try to fight their way through this and to regain their place in the world in a competitive spirit. The most recent piece I wrote last week in the Times was a plea by a senior politician to other world leaders saying we have to work together on this. So that seems to be true insofar as the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic is concerned. But to be honest with you, that is, awful though it is, apparently still relatively minor compared to the climate change catastrophe which is awaiting us. I've had the real privilege of being able to see some advanced drafts of Alistair McIntosh's forthcoming book, Riders in the Storm. I think Alistair's with us this evening. And Alistair is setting out in this book an extraordinary distillation of where we are on the climate change situation. And it's really, really difficult, really challenging. So again, Charlie, it seems to me, and I would say this, wouldn't I, that the only way that we're going to deal with, however we deal with adaptation, mitigation, overcoming, just living with climate change as it manifests itself, is to work cooperatively. And as I say, actually in something which hasn't been published, which just came out yesterday, we may criticize the Chinese and the Russians, for example, and maybe there's some justification for that. But as our friend Ken Cloke says, you know, if the boat's sinking, it doesn't actually matter what end you're at. And the Russians and the Chinese are in the boat, and that's the point. And we shouldn't forget that. And so somehow or other, we need to find ways to engage with even those who we see as our enemies, or even those who we think have interests which are inconsistent with ours. Somehow or other, overcoming that. And it will take an enormous amount of self-reflection and self-discipline. And of course, canny, thoughtful engagement, courageous engagement, without being naive. What is it we say in the course? We should be trustworthy, but not trusting. When we always look, when we look for consistency in behavior, but always be careful about the behavior of others. But my goodness me, we don't find that way going forward in the very, very short next few years. It's a pity that COP26 has been cancelled in Glasgow. And let's hope it happens very soon thereafter, because within that lies one of the seeds which need to bear fruit. So I don't know. I mean, it's a sort of thing that Well, let's face it, I don't know about you, but I wake up every morning, and I wake up early every morning now, and I can't get back to sleep. And it's as if we're living in some sort of a dream. And you know, it's this is extraordinary what's going on around about us. We've never experienced anything like this before. And climate change doesn't have the imminence, therefore we don't feel it as viscerally. But climate change has an even greater potential impact on us. So, you know, my heartfelt plea and passion, and the reason perhaps for releasing this book, is that we all think very seriously about cooperating with each other. You know, the Bertrand Russell quote, to which I will return, is that, what is it? The only thing which will redeem mankind, let's say humankind, is cooperation. How true that is.
Well, John, we're getting near to the end of our time for having a chat. We're going to open it up to questions via chat. But before I do, you mentioned the course there, and so you would expect me to ask you one more question, and that is, what else do you need to tell us?
Do you want me to promote the course? I don't know. I think it'd be very interesting to hear. Actually, it's very interesting. The timing has gone almost as we hoped it might. So that's great. At least time for questions and observations. I really would be interested to hear what people have to say about some of the points that I have raised. I would mention the podcast, actually, which I have been putting out over the last few weeks. I wanted to get some more material out a slightly different way. So these are much more specifically skills based, and I think the time has come for all of us who've got material to try and share it. So really to undergird that idea of let's skill ourselves up to be more cooperative. So maybe that's the last thing I would mention. But Charlie, let's open it up.
Okay, let's have a look at it. Well, actually, there's been quite a bit of chat going on already. Actually, and you mentioned Charlie Irvin there. He has a question here about how do you personally coax people who are nervous or anxious or skeptical to take part in mediation?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and can I deal with that, Charlie, by reference to something that's happened quite recently, and it's to do with the use of Zoom for mediation. So I had a mediation which was due to take place, and I won't give any specifics because it might identify who's involved, almost immediately after the lockdown began, and therefore we couldn't have the mediation which was prepared for a physical meeting. And one party was very keen to continue and to move straight into the Zoom world. The other party and its lawyer were unfamiliar with the use of Zoom. In fact, were unfamiliar with the use of technology, and were really, really nervous. And as far as they were concerned, they would just wait until the lockdown was finished, which they hoped would be sometime in May, and we would just have a mediation maybe in early June. I think they came to realize that was probably slightly optimistic. But what's been interesting about that is it's taken us 3 weeks of gentle conversation and practice, first of all, the telephone, and then just getting Zoom installed, and then getting the laptops up to date, getting some technology help. And this week, we had just a private session, the lawyer, the client, and myself using Zoom. And it worked, and it worked really well. And we did a little practice of the breakout rooms just to show how it would work. And I'm optimistic that will now move into this virtual space, because they need to settle this. It's one of these ones that can't really wait for several months. So I think for all of these situations, I mean, you can't push somebody who doesn't want to do it, take a horse to water and all that sort of thing. But I think just gentle encouragement, asking questions, being open, finding out what it is that's worrying people, what concerns them, and working with them to try to overcome these if they can, and then ultimately giving them choice. I mean, ultimately, mediation is about choice and about decisions made by people who are autonomous, consenting adults. But I think that applies also to process and the engagement itself.
Actually, there's one more practical question here on the chat, which I think Ainsley has answered, but more generally, is the book available on Kindle? And the answer is yes, and the link is there on the chat line as well. I think it was in the invitation as well. Oliver Escobar has got a wee question for you, John, about if mediation is a basic skill, why is it not yet part of the mainstream curricula in schools and universities?
Well, I'd quite like to ask Oliver that back, given that he is a very distinguished member of a senior university. And actually, can I commend Oliver's work, just as I would Charlie's, in this field of dialogue. I mean, Oliver is just one of the leading experts in Scotland in this whole area, and he and I have been working on the Citizens' Assembly together. I don't know. I mean, it's very frustrating, actually. There's Charlie. Charlie is Charlie Irvin, who runs the mediation clinic and mediation training at Strathclyde University. But Strathclyde is one of the universities which has tended to lead the way in this training. It really has not become as deeply embedded in legal training as it might. And many would argue that it ought to also be embedded in the business schools. But I suspect we need to go right back to primary and secondary education, because the skills of mediation, listening, questioning, looking to understand what goes on under the surface, dealing with the diagnosis rather than just the symptoms, all of these could be taught, I'm sure, in a rudimentary way at schools. And having said that, of course, peer mediation in Scotland is a big success, and awards have been given to the leaders in peer mediation in Scotland. So I suppose what one would hope is, as with mediation more generally, that these seeds planted would continue to be scattered throughout the educational system at all levels and flourish. But it will take, as our report last year recognised, some really conscious action at a policy level by the government and elsewhere, business organisations, educational authorities, to promote the teaching of mediation. So I think, Oliver, my answer to you is it needs all of us here, and it's not just mediators, recognising the value of these skills, whether we call them mediation or dialogue or better conversations, to try to encourage those who deliver educational programmes to include all of this within these programmes.
And just building on that, a question from Alistair McIntosh here about reflecting on the nature of the skills that can be taught as far as mediation as a technique is concerned, and the degree to which it needs to be embodied in a sort of personal presence or bearing that the mediator brings to the mediation. So there's balance between the who, I suppose, of the mediator and the skills that they bring with them. Any reflections on that?
Yeah, well, when people who know me and have known me for a long time and from the past will know that I would often have exhibited the classic characteristics of a mediator. And in fact, over the years, I freely confess that even in the mediation world, I have not necessarily behaved with the kind of courtesy, dignity and respect for others which one would expect of a mediator. So I think what I take from that is we're all Jock Tamson's bairns, we're all imperfect. I'm deeply impressed, having been involved in skills training now for the best part of 30 years, actually, because I was involved in advocacy training before mediation and negotiation training. I'm deeply impressed by the idea that most of us can acquire skills and we can rewire our neural pathways. Tim Hicks would tell us that as well. And we can learn these skills so that they become a much more natural part of who we are. I mean, it takes discipline, it takes courage, it takes humility, it takes responsibility, all of these words that I know we refer to very often when we're doing training together. So I mean, there may be something about certain individuals which makes them more suited to mediation. I mean, one has to be interested in people. In fact, my mediator colleague in London with whom I was having conversations today used the expression, he said, I just love the people I work with. Who's genuinely interested in them and the problems, is not judgmental about them, and he really loves trying to help them to sort out, for him, very complex commercial situations. So I think there's a combination of one's natural personality and aptitude, but very much augmented, Charlie and Alistair, by skills that we can learn. And one of the things we need to do, perhaps, takes us back to Oliver Escobar's point, is to inculcate these skills at as early a level as possible so they become part of the natural, habitual way that we conduct ourselves, moving away from the almost a default to the adversarial or the fight or flight, and we all have that limbic part of our brain, to the more thoughtful, the neocortex part of the brain, where we are more reflective, more thoughtful. We pause before we speak. We reflect before we say something that might be offensive. We listen to what somebody else has to say. We can train ourselves to listen to what somebody has to say. So there we are. It's a long-winded answer, Charlie and Alistair, to what I think is a combination of features.
And we talked a bit about resistance as well to mediation. There's a question here about, do we need another word for mediation? If so, what might it be? We've talked about this quite a few times. Any reflections you'd like to share on that?
Yeah, I remember going through all this myself, actually, when we set up the business. One of the reasons we ended up with Core Solutions, because we had Core Mediation as a brand as well, and people often still refer to Core Mediation, is that we wanted to look at what we were actually doing and producing rather than what we were providing by way of a service. So outcomes and solutions seem to be appropriate, although the word solutions is greatly overused. I think we'll start with mediation. I mean, I think that around the world, mediation is used and is understood. In some respects, it carries a pejorative meaning, and we have to work with that and live with that. It's interesting to me, actually, while accepting that mediation now is part of the currency and we generally will have to use it, I've had 2 or 3 mediations of late, and again, I recognise that I blogged about this not long ago, where they have asked me to be the facilitator, and the agreement has been a facilitation agreement. Every other word roughly the same, but we were facilitating. My modus operandi was pretty similar to what it would be as a mediator, but apparently there were contractual conditions which lay behind dispute resolution clauses, which made mediation too formal for them. So facilitation is a good word to use as an alternative, if not a substitute, for mediation. And maybe we just have to be thoughtful in every circumstance about what we're doing. We're helping people to deal with differences, with difficult situations, to have difficult conversations. And sometimes we're guides, sometimes we're facilitators, sometimes we're sounding boards, sometimes we're mediators. I think we just have to be careful not to get too hung up on language, which almost inevitably constrains us and our thinking.
Okay. So specific question now about the book, John, which was this is from Anna Howard, which was the hardest piece for you to write and why?
I wonder if Anna has actually been reading the book. Can I just say of Anna and of David Lee, if David's here, that these are the 2 people who I mentioned in the introduction who have inspired me to write so many of these pieces. Anna is the editor of the Clover Mediation blog site, and Anna has been such an encouragement to me. And David Lee, I think I first produced an article for the Scotsman Law Pages in 2003, and that was thanks to David. So Anna, the answer to your question is the last but one, which was the piece, which is the very last chapter in this book, and that was the piece for the Scotsman Law Pages in I think the second week after the lockdown began. And I think I began with the words, what does one say at a time like this? So it was difficult to know what to say as well as what to write, and how easy it is to be glib at a time like this. So I think, yeah, that something began as a difficult piece to write. It flowed after a while, but it required a lot of thought.
Here's a good one. What was the best question you've ever been asked, and why was it so good? So it probably wasn't one you've been asked tonight.
Well, I think that's it, Charlie. The question you've just asked is the best question, because I can't think of it.
Here's the follow-up to it as well in it. So how have you learned to ask great questions?
Listen to my podcasts. I've actually produced 4 podcasts on questioning skills in the last 2 weeks, and I was very lucky because I got into skills training in 1993-94 when I inaugurated the Faculty of Advocates at Scottish Bar's Advocacy Skills Training Programme. And one of the key areas of work for us was questioning techniques. And we learned from the Americans in the National Institute for Trial Advocacy all about questioning skills. And this wonderful phrase, which was the feature of my most recent podcast, why am I asking this question of this person at this time in this way? We just think about breaking that down, the why, the what, the who, the when, and the how. And I learned so much from that, and I've been able to take that into the field of mediation. So it's practice. I used to write them all down. As I went into mediation, I would have a little mind map with what are your needs, what are your wants, what are your objectives, what worries you, what concerns you, what might the other side be thinking. And over a period of time, these become more natural, I suppose. So I'm a great fan, as many of you will know, of the short, sharp, open question. And so over the years, certainly for the purposes of mediation and training and facilitation, that's been really my main tool, I think, the short, sharp, open question, and again, the willingness to listen to what people say by way of answer. So, and there's, for me, that's a real learning, because when I started off as an advocate at the bar, I had no idea about open and closed questions. I learned about them on my course in North Carolina, I remember in 1993. There is a judgment somewhere by a very senior judge criticizing my formulation of questions. They were formed in such a way that meant that the evidence elicited was completely irrelevant. So over the years, I had to learn how to ask the questions which help.
And there's some slightly broader question here about, is back to the schools training and the like. To what extent do you think more work in philosophy, philosophical literacy might help at an early age to build, particularly some of the things around ethical reasoning and like that may help?
Gosh, maybe that's the most interesting question.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I would actually like to know what the motivation is behind that question, what the person asking the question is thinking about. I don't think it's essential. I think we could all learn these skills. I think we can be very effective practitioners without a deep philosophical grounding. I think ethics is different. I mean, I think that mediation works because I hope nearly all of those who are mediators are well motivated, have lying behind their work the primary driver, which is to help people to solve difficult problems and to help people to do well. And there's a whole ethical dimension there, I think, to what we do, because although we are powerless, I often say that in our powerlessness lies a certain type of power. It's a power of influence, it's a power of shape thinking. So I think that's important. Now, I mean, I personally am interested in the philosophical discussions. I just wonder if Alistair McIntosh asked the question, actually, because Alistair's interested in, no, he didn't, all right, interested in philosophy. So I'm sure that philosophy can undergird and enhance how we think about these things. I think I would split the two. I think certainly an ethical, values-based component in education is really, really helpful, maybe essential.
Okay. And here, quite a specific one about how to navigate a situation where the mediator is confronted with someone who has a conflict of conscience or principle. How would you approach that?
Well, that's interesting. Again, not unheard of course. I suppose politics might be a good example of it. I mean, I think that the recent struggles within the churches are a very good example of that, where there have been some genuinely extremely difficult conversations around same-sex marriage, for example. And I know that a lot of the work that's been done in the churches in the context of respectful dialogue has been extremely helpful. And in that situation, one is not seeking to find necessarily reconciliation or resolution, but deep understanding. So I think that where there are matters of conscience like that, one should not be seeking to change somebody's mind. If they do change, that would be a matter for them, a matter of choice for them. But to enable people deeply to understand where somebody else with a different perspective is coming from and why, and to be able to express their own points of view, so that at the very least, they each understand not only what they say and think, but why. And of course, from that, very often what one finds is that the differences are far less than they're imagined to be. Was it Jo Cox, the sadly murdered MP, said in her maiden speech, we have much more in common than ever divides us, but maybe because of the way our brains are wired, we tend to focus on the difference, and that becomes magnified. And that's certainly so in some of these debates around the church, for example. But the more that one gets into respectful conversation and dialogue, the more people realize how much they have in common. And it might just be that in that situation, deep love, not only for each other, but for others, is much more important and becomes much more important than some of the religious, theological, or other differences which they may hold. But I suppose the goal there, Charlie, is to find a way to somehow accommodate differences of view and to nevertheless live and work together. And let's face it, while we and I have made a plea for cooperation, of course, and collaboration. We are unique individuals. We have a vast array of differences of view and personality. We are diverse, and thank goodness for that. That's the nature of the human beast as well. So I think the balance between diversity of being, of thought, and view, alongside this need, this huge need to work together and to journey together, that balance is the one that we're resting for all the time. Okay.
Well, there's still one or two questions coming in, but I'm conscious of promising to finish this by 7 o'clock. So I think what I'm going to do now is just take this opportunity to thank John and thank everybody for participating. To remind you again that the book is for sale on Amazon in both in paperback and Kindle form, with proceeds going to cancer research. John's mentioned his podcast gives you an opportunity to access more of John's wisdom and experience. So John, a final word for you, and perhaps an opportunity to tell us a bit more about those podcasts if you wish, but over to you to see us out.
I think you said enough about the podcast. I don't think there's any. They can be found on SoundCloud and on our website. I'm just looking up here. Yeah, there is one thing I want to mention actually, and that is that next Wednesday at 7 p.m, we're having a different kind of event on Zoom involving Alistair McIntosh, and I've made mention of Alistair, who's with us this evening, and Ken Cloke, who is, for many of us, one of the main inspirations behind the work that we do. His books have been absolutely central to my thinking and development as a mediator. And sadly, Ken couldn't be with us 4 weeks ago because of the lockdown. But Alistair and Ken are going to be in conversation with me next Wednesday on the pandemic and climate change, and thinking about what that means for consciousness and collaboration. So I won't expand on what will be, I think, a deeply interesting ethical and philosophical discussion by two of the most inspiring writers that I know. So I just wanted to mention that. More information again on Eventbrite or just email us in the office. I think it just remains really for me to say thank you. I want to thank Ainsley Francis, because Ainsley's been very helpful this evening, but also very helpful in putting the book together, particularly putting up with my constant need to make tiny changes and then go back and reverse those changes and do something different again. But has been very much involved this week in making sure that the books in both paperback and Kindle form are actually on Amazon, not only in the UK, but in the US and elsewhere. So thank you very much, Ainsley. Thanks to Paula in the office, who has come in very recently to CORE and has had, if not a baptism of fire, certainly a baptism that she wouldn't have expected with all the changes that are going on. Is coping with it wonderfully well. And Louise as well, I see Louise Dunlop has been very much a part of our preparation for this event today. We've had one or two wee rehearsals into how we use Zoom. So thank you, Louise. Charlie, big thanks to you. Can't believe it's all those years since we first met, but you have been a constant in my life over that period of time, and you have been somebody who I think has accepted me as I am, warts and all, and have really supported me. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for engaging so thoughtfully with me this evening. And thank you to everybody for coming along. There are a lot of really good friends, people I've known for many, many years, and we've traveled together in so many different ways, as well as some people that I've never seen before or met before. And I hope that in some way or other, our paths may cross in the weeks, months, or years to come. My last remarks, let me just check up here. Yeah, just got one more. There is one other song I want to refer to, 1859, so it's a great time to end, because I just found it in one of my pieces in the book today. It was an article about resilience and about persisting as a mediator, even when it all seems lost and people are going out the door. Stick at it, because you just never know. There's just another move, something else at the margin that might just work. And I have a couple of examples of that in the book. And the song which I refer to at the very end of that little piece is a song by a Scottish band called Pilot. And the song was the B-side of a #1 hit in 1975, I think, called January. And the song is called Never Give Up. So can I just leave you with that thought, folks? However tough the going may be, and however difficult it may be at the margins do count. Never give up. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.